Hello and welcome to Ace the English Hub. In today's video, we look at the literary movement Romanticism. Romanticism is a movement in Western civilization during the last quarter of the 18th century and the first 20 to 30 years of the 19th century that characterized many works of literature, painting, music, architecture, and criticism. During this period, there was a rejection of the ideals and rules of classicism and neoclassicism, and importance shifted to a more subjective expression of passion and personal feelings. While the classical standards were on balance, order, restraint, proportion, and objectivity, Romanticism upheld the values of imaginative spontaneity, visionary originality, wonder, and emotional self-expression. Let's look at the history of the word. The word romantic has come to mean so many things. The word has a complex and interesting history. In the Middle Ages, the term romance denoted the new vernacular languages derived from Latin. There were also similar terms that meant to compose or translate books in the vernacular. A roman or romance came to be known as an imaginative work and a courtly romance. The terms also signified a popular book and even something new and different. By the 17th century, in Britain and France, the term romance acquired the derogatory connotations of the fanciful, bizarre, exaggerated, chimerical. In France, there were two derivations of the term, which had two different connotations. The term romantique came to be later used in English in the 18th century in this sense. In Germany, the word romantisch was used in the 17th century in the French sense of romanesque, and then from the middle of the 18th century, the usage shifted to the English sense of gentle melancholy. Friedrich Schlegel, a German poet, critic, and philosopher, is generally considered the first person who established the term romantic in literary context, but he identified it as depicting emotional matter in an imaginative form. He also equated romantic with Christian. His brother August Schlegel implied that romantic literature is in contrast with classicism, thus producing the paradox between the two terms. In his work, The Decline and Fall of the Romantic Ideal, F.L. Lucas counted 11,396 definitions of Romanticism. In the work Classic, Romantic, and Modern, Barson cites examples of synonymous usage for romantic, which show that it is perhaps the most remarkable example of a term which can mean many things according to personal and individual needs. Coming to Romanticism in England. In England, the period from the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 or the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 is considered the beginning of the Romantic period. It lasted the first 3 decades of the 19th century. Now, what were the reasons that led to the rise of Romanticism in England? A nationalistic and individualistic sentiment arose in the late 18th century as a result of movements like the American and French revolutions. This importance on individualistic sentiment resulted in the denial of the ideals of neoclassicism. The French Revolution in the early 1790s fostered the sense in Romantic writers that theirs was a great age of new beginnings and high possibilities. In Britain, there were several other factors too. The expansions of commerce, periodical literature, and literacy made the artists and writers less dependent on noble patrons. There was an open cultural marketplace where writers were able to discover their own audiences. Many critics, including Emma Abrams and Raymond Williams, have noted that the Romantics saw themselves as inheriting a disfigured and fragmented world. Their task was to seek once again a unifying vision, usually through the aesthetic and cultural realms. Coming to romantic subjects, Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads in 1800 is considered the poetic manifesto of Romanticism. The Lyrical Ballads placed importance on the subject of the common man. We'll learn more about lyrical ballads in our videos on the history of English literature. Romantics like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and others dealt with the realm of the supernatural and the far away and the long ago. Poets like William Blake, Wordsworth, and P.B. Shelley presented the persona of a poet-prophet who writes a visionary mode of poetry. The subjects of the romantic poems, whether the poets themselves or other people, were no longer represented as part of an organized society, but typically as solitary figures engaged in a long and sometimes infinitely elusive quest. Often they were also social nonconformists or outcasts. Many important romantic works had as protagonist the isolated rebel. Coming to romantic philosophy, Wordsworth argued that the opposite of poetry was not prose but science. The romantic revolt against scientific empiricism is similar to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Romantic writers like Coleridge and Carlyle followed Immanuel Kant's philosophy of transcendental idealism. This new philosophical idealism endorsed the Romantics' view of the human mind as organically creative and encouraged most of them to regard the natural world as a living mirror to the soul, not as a dead matter for scientific dissection. Many writers viewed a human being as endowed with limitless aspiration toward an infinite good envisioned by the faculty of imagination. Features of Romanticism. Even though some writers like Keats and Shelley continued to employ elements of Greek mythology and adapted the classical form of the ode, they scorned the imitation of classical models and placed the importance on creative imagination. The Augustan styles of satire and didacticism were replaced by lyric and narrative poetry. The Romantic writers revered Shakespeare and Milton as their principal models of the poet's imaginative genius. There was also the use of poetic symbolism in the works of Blake and Shelley, which placed significance on objects beyond their physical qualities. The English Romantics, like the Romantic poets and composers in other countries, took a partly nationalistic direction and valued their local vernacular traditions. The other aspects of Romanticism in the 18th century are an increasing interest in nature and in the natural, primitive and uncivilized way of life, a growing interest in scenery, especially its more untamed and disorderly manifestations, an association of human moods with the moods of nature, and thus a subjective feeling for it and interpretation of it. A considerable emphasis on natural religion, emphasis on the need for spontaneity in thought and action and in the expression of thought, increasing importance attached to natural genius and the power of the imagination, a tendency to exalt the individual and his needs and emphasis on the need for a freer and more personal expression, the cult of the noble savage. In all these connections, Rousseau is a major figure in the 18th century, and his influence in the pre-Romantic period through his works was immense. There are other notable works which expressed a new vision of man and his role in the world. Romanticism in US. Romanticism flourished in the United States in the somewhat later period, between 1820 and 60, with James Fenimore Cooper's historical romances, Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, Herman Melville's novels, Edgar Allan Poe's tales and poetry, the poems of H.W. Longfellow and Walt Whitman, and the nature writings of Thoreau. 1830 to 65, the era these writers belong to is sometimes called the American Romantic period. Now, what are the differences between Romanticism in England and the rest of Europe? Romantic tendency is first seen in Germany during the 1760s and 1770s with the rise of the Sturm und Drang, or the storm and stress movement, that experimented with new subjective modes of expression and of the linguistic basis and cultural functions of art. The German Romantics belonged to roughly two generations known as the Fur Romantic and the Hochro Romantic, or the High Romantics. The earlier group were the philosophers and aestheticians of the new movement and revolution, while the latter group had poets and writers of stories. Both were movements of intense activity and national importance. The Romantic movement came considerably later to France because of the French Revolution and also because of the French devotion to classicism and neoclassicism. The works of writers like Lamartine and Victor Hugo were the main influence to start with. Later came writers including Dumas. One of the founders of Romanticism, its so-called father, was a French thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who adopted a return to nature and equated the increasing growth and refinement of civilization with corruption, artificiality, and mechanization. Rousseau's social contract embraces democratic principles and begins with a famous sentence, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." This statement was important for Romanticism and for the French Revolution, and Rousseau's influence on subsequent Romantic writers was profound. While one group held Romanticism as a kind of renaissance and rediscovery, there are others who support Goethe's later attitude that it was a sickness of the spirit and a disorganizing eruption of subjectivism. That's all for today. See you again in another video.